Okay, good afternoon, all. This is Chuck Ternitza with the CISO Wargaming and Simulation Study Group. And today we have a guest speaker, Sebastian Bay, is going to talk to us about professional wargaming, maybe his design, some of the things he's been involved in lately, and so on. This should be a really good talk with a lot of great information. So without further ado, I'll come back around at the end and give you some information about our organization joining. It's free, and we have some interesting conversation, interesting projects going on. But for now, I'm going to turn it over to Sebastian. All right, it's all yours.
Hey, thanks, Chuck. Um, so for this briefing, I've organized it into essentially three parts, which is one is a brief overview of what war games are and what they aren't, how war games are used in the DoD professional realm, which I will not focus too much on given this crowd. And then I'll have the last portion, which is looking at Littoral Commander Indo-Pacific, which is a professional military education game that I designed and how I designed it in terms of the design approach, some of the analytical techniques that we use to come up with the mechanics and sort of the data that undercuts it, and then spend a good chunk of time on questions. So that's my plan forward. So first things first, my name is Sebastian Bay. I'm a research analyst and senior game designer at CNA's gaming integration program. I work on a wide range of games for the Navy, the Marine Corps, the Joint Force writ large, and other government agencies. I teach a graduate course called Basics of Wargaming at Georgetown University's Center for Security Studies, where my students will design, research, and execute educational in-the-box game as part of the course. One thing I will say is these opinions and views are mine alone. If you don't like what I say, they do not reflect the policies or views of my employer, our sponsors, or anything else. One last disclaimer is Littoral Commander is a personal game. It is a game I design on my free time. It is not a CNA game. It is not a Georgetown game. So again, if you dislike what I did with Littoral Commander, the fault lies with me. All right. With all that aside, let's proceed. So first things first, I love the joke that Graham Longley Brown, who's a UK-based wargamer, says, "What do you call a group of wargamers?" And it is called an argument, because whenever you get a group of wargamers together, they tend to argue about something, and one of those somethings always tends to be what is a wargame. But for our purposes today in this presentation, I'm going to say a wargame is a dynamic representation of conflict and competition in a synthetic environment in which people make decisions and respond to the consequences of those decisions. This definition is largely brought from Peter Perla in his wider work in The Art of Wargaming and subsequent articles. The major points that you should think about this is that a war game, right? Winston, my dog, is very adamant about this definition, is it has some kind of abstraction of conflict, right? There is some kind of synthetic environment, whether that is a game board or digital console or a digital environment. But the most important portion that distinguishes it from models and sims and other mediums, right, like military exercises like RIMPAC or Cobra Gold, is that there is an emphasis on decisions and consequences. That dynamic of interaction and feedback within the game and agency of players is incredibly important, and it is one of the key hallmarks of a war game. So if you do not have at least decisions and consequences, it is not a game. Right. I have a wide tent approach in terms of games thematically. So this is the one I like to use. So what comprises the elements of a game? And I've broken down into 5 general points, which is the scenario, the game system, the adjudication system, the victory conditions, and analytical framework. Other people like to parse out the pieces of a game differently, but this is how I like to think about it. The scenario is often in professional circles called the road to war. It is the story. It is how we got to the point in which we are jumping off. Right. This is important because, I mean, McGrady and Perla and others often say war games are constructed narratives. They involve players as the actors of the story, and the game is the medium in which those characters and their actions garner meaning, right? so the scenario is often like, how do we get here, the strategic setting, the operational setting, and so forth. It is the landscape in which they start existing in the world, right? This can take the form of political constraints, right? Whether it has rules of engagements, or you may say, hey, a historical setting of like, this is the Battle of Trafalgar, right? The game system is what most people typically think of a game, which is it comprises the rules, the structures, the mechanics, and so forth of how players engage. The best way to think of a game system is, how do players convert their intentions and decisions into actions, right? The game system should be able to do that, right? So if I invest in a technology, I have some mechanic in the game that allows me to do that, either by moving cubes or increasing a level development metric or so forth, right? Many people consider the adjudication system as a core element of the game system. The reason I parse it out is that for first-time people who are introduced to games, I want this to have an emphasis. The adjudication system is part of the wider game system that essentially judges the player's actions and their decisions and their interactions, right? So if my action in the game system, right, through a mechanic is to deploy tactical aircraft, and my opponent does the same, the adjudication system is the thing that determines what happens when those two actions collide, when actions are put up against each other. This can be done in a myriad of ways, from dice rolling, D&D style, to rigid rule sets like combat result tables, or it can be done by white cell subject matter expertise. How you do that, how you do adjudication, will depend on your purpose and what you're trying to get out of your game. But fundamentally, the adjudication system is how actions are judged. The next component that is incredibly important is victory conditions. Why are victory conditions important? Is because they animate the player's decisions, because they provide direction and focus, and also an objective to achieve. It provides the motivation for their actions. If I tell you, hey, take your job in terms of victory is to take this many hills, they will prioritize their actions, assess risk, and assess trade-offs according to the things that you tell them are important, whether it's by targets, by seizing territory, or by accruing points, right? Whatever victory conditions you have will motivate the players and often affect their player behavior. That's why it is incredibly important. Is less about winning and more about how it affects players' decisions and their thinking throughout the game and how they're played. The last portion is the analytical framework. I will say not all games will have analytical frameworks, not mainly because not all games are analytical in purpose. Analytical frameworks, often called DCAPs or data collection analytical plans, are ways to essentially collect, assess, information and data from a game in a systemic manner, right? This can take many forms in terms of game products, right, in which players fill out every turn, into surveys at the end, hot washes. Also, typically, at CNA and other places, we will also give our data collectors and our analysts like priorities. Like, these are the things that we're asking. These are the questions we're asking. These are sub questions that you should pay attention to in terms of conversations, or even highlight key terms to allow our data collectors to sift through in real time also what data they're collecting, because they are often barraged and overwhelmed with the amount of conversations, decisions, and actions that the players are often taking. So what are the types of games that are often used in professional gaming? We can categorize these in many different ways, but the way I have categorized them is based on a RAND study that Yuna Wong and I, when we are RAND, used for the Marine Corps, which is breaking it into 5 broad buckets, which is concept development, capability development, senior leadership, support to war plans or operational plans, and then training and education. The best way to think about this is that concept development looks at sort of developing or exploring an idea. There's often a concept of military operations, but it can also be different, the implementation of a particular technology, like let's say AI or a particular type of munition. The Air Force tends to call these S&T games, or science and technology games, but the core element of this purpose is often exploring some kind of future or novel concept, right? It doesn't always have to be future, but they tend to be largely future oriented. Capability development games are often in support of three major things, which is budget decisions, force design, and resource allocation. This is really the notion of like, how do we design the force? It's often organizational. For example, when I was at McWill, we did a series of concept development games on EABO, which is the graphic on the far right-hand side, looking at how to look at, you know, I mean, expeditionary advanced basing operations in various theaters, right? Like, how do we do this operationally and tactically, right? And then other games that were in tandem with them were capability development games of, if we want to be able to do this, how do we build the service to do that in terms of training, in terms of budget, in terms of capability development? What assets do we invest or divest of so we can produce the service that can execute this concept? Senior leadership games are often socialization games or strategic discussion games that tend to be much shorter than the previous two. Concept and capability games tend to, on average, be about 3 to 5 days, sometimes even longer. Senior leadership games tend to be about like 1 hour to 4 hours, right? The longest senior leadership game I have ever run was like a day and a half, right? And you know what I mean, there were parts of it that were, you know what I mean, only action officers only. So senior leadership time is a premium, and then these tend to be really condensed. They tend to be focused on either socializing idea, having some kind of high level discussion before you get to the granular details to provide guidance for lower level games that tend to be concept or capabilities focused. They can also be used as like alliance partnership games where senior leaders, whether they're defense ministers or chiefs of staffs and so forth, get together to discuss some kind of strategic question or problem in a condensed way where their decisions have some kind of grounding in a context or scenario or narrative. The next game is support to O plans or war plans. These are personally one of my favorites because I prefer tactical and operational games. I find them really interesting and fascinating because they're really difficult, right? Which is to support how O plans are written. Combatant commands on sort of every few years will revise, update, or devise new O plans. These are the war plans that sit on the shelf at a combatant command, breaking in case of glass if XYZ happens. And as part of this process, war games are done to help assess different COAs, courses of actions, different concepts that you may want to do, or even integrate different things that may have changed since the last time you wrote this O plan. Last thing is the large, broad bucket of training education. Training is not synonymous with education. Training tends to be skill-based. Education tends to be knowledge and so sort of critical thinking based. But we, for this taxonomy, we have put them together, which is about educating players and transferring knowledge and some kind of skill set to them, right? So those are the broad 5 buckets in which professional gaming can be conceived of. The next portion, I will provide a very, very brief overview of these 3 sort of case studies to think about games for those who have never learned or been exposed to professional gaming. The first case is the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, also known as WA2, the U.S. Naval War College's interwar period games, and then the post-World War II from the 60s, really to the 70s to the early 90s, TAC War family games for the Marine Corps. So WA2 was a group of in the British Navy that focused on how to combat U-boats during the Battle of the Atlantic. They used both educational and analytical games to do those. Their analytical games were used to essentially deduce and try to figure out how the U-boats attack the convoys to best understand their tactics, to therefore devise counter tactics, right? So you see the black and white photo, you see the wrens in the middle of the picture where they have like sticks showing different positions of convoys and so forth, and you see the chalk lines indicating different positions of ships throughout the time, indicating their direction, their orientation, and their speed, and so forth. Right? You see the commanders or the players on the right hand side looking through a hole of a sheet. Essentially, that was designed to limit their situational awareness to only really the area around their ships. Right, this was a way to represent that fog of war as you're trying to, escort convoys across the dark Pacific. Right, these games are really powerful in the way they paired and complement analytical games. Analytical games produce tactics, right, like Raspberry and other tactics that essentially improve the PK of killing German U-boats during the Battle of the Atlantic. Right. At the same time, they use those tactics and refine them with real life intelligence that we're getting back from the fleet with after action reports and intelligence updates and so forth. And there was adaptations to those tactics, and those tactics were then disseminated to groups as they were coming forth and to and back from the Battle of the Atlantic to increase institutional knowledge across the force, right? So educational games to disseminate knowledge, right? Analytical games to produce knowledge is a great example of how those things can be married up together. One slight tangent I will mention is that the German U-boats also devised their own war games to look at how to battle better fight the Battle of the Atlantic. Originally, they fought in single alone submarines, eventually evolved to wolf packs to counter some of the tactics that Watu eventually designed to counter the U-boat threat. Going back in time a little bit further is the interwar period games before the Second World War. The U.S. Naval War College held a series of educational games for its officers and students from essentially the end of the First World War, even a little bit before in the early 1910s, all the way to the war. These series of games were mainly comprised of 3 games: Duel, Fleet, Tactical, and Strategic. Duel really focused on single one-on-one surface actions. Fleet Tactical represented 2 fleets pitted against each other, and then Strategic involved multiple fleets across a theater of operation working in tandem together to fight. One thing I will say is that gaming was a huge portion of this curriculum during this time. Of the roughly 320-ish days of instruction, they had 6 days of instruction. They only got Sundays off. Roughly 300 days had some form of gaming or game prep. This was to integrate their lectures and their seminars that they would get from their instructors, and then eventually work in teams or cohorts to develop plans for their games and essentially have and then test each other's plans in these games. They would have both junior courses and senior courses that would have to play different portions of those games and plan for different portions of those games throughout the year. Eventually, during the early 1910s ish, Duel essentially fell out of favor, and a lot of the focus fell on Fleet, Tactical, and Strategic. These are the games that often Nimitz and others during the Second World War referred to as the games they played on the floor of the Naval War College. And there's a famous quote by Nimitz says that only the kamikaze was the thing that was not anticipated by the things they played. One thing I will say is that these games are great. They're a great example of pedagogy and integrating game-based learning into professional military education. But one thing I will say is that they are not perfect. They had their own bad assumptions. They did not get everything right. It's not like they had out of the war college a perfect plan that they went into the war with, right? They made certain assumptions. They made some bad assumptions about carrier-based aviation and submarines, right? But also at the same time, they revealed certain insights about the importance of forward operating positions, the importance of coordination across fleets and C2. So there is both good and bad with these games, but the idea is that the moral of the story for these games is that you had a generation of officers not trying to produce a singular plan, right? But a whole generation of officers asked to think hard and long about a wicked hard problem, and eventually allow them to have synthetic experiences in which they could pull from across their experience before the war. So Spruance, Halsey, Nimitz, they all went through this course at various times, and they had actually very different experiences with these games as these games evolved over their tenure. TAC War is a series of games of 4 games for the Marine Corps that was spawned out of a game called the Landing Force game, which eventually was turned into the educational war game. And then eventually that was too complicated and they broke it down into 4 different games, often colloquially called the TAC War family of games. These games involve TAC War, Steel Thrust, Landing Force, and Warfare. TAC War focused on the battalion and lower level, right? So battalion company level, very similar to, like, let's say Dunkemp, which is the army version of it around the same time. Steel Thrust focused on what we call the MEU today. Landing Force really focused on what we call the MEB or the brigade level, and Warfare focused on the MEF level, what we call. You see a photo from the National Archives from 1986 of 2 Marines playing TAC War, the battalion level game. And you see that they have hung orders above, like, sort of PVC pipes that go over the table. And the games were incredibly detailed, right? TAC War was probably the thing that most people can recognize right away, mainly because it looks like has many commercial elements. It involves miniatures, it involves rule sets, it involves CRTs, there are detection ratings. They even had rules for how orders were disseminated and how fast units could respond to orders, depending on what was the difference in echelon. So if a regiment issued an order to a company, it will be slower than if a battalion issued an order to its subordinate companies and so forth, right? So they had all these interesting commercial elements to it. As it went through the different echelons, going higher from steel thrust, landing force, and warfare, these games evolved to be more like CPXs, command post exercises, where steel thrust was a blend where there was some manual elements, but they had also sort of command post exercises where they were in different rooms issuing orders and so forth. And as you got closer to warfare, it became more and more like a staff exercise where they were exercising their staff functions, right? You incorporating more role playing game mechanics, right? But the important lesson from the TAC War family of games is that there is no singular game that fixes everything or addresses every problem, right? One of the brilliant parts of the TAC War family of games is that they understood each of those trading audiences required different skills and knowledge and decision making and had represented different decision space. So they made games that reflected what they had to do at that echelon, right? Another lesson from this TAC War family of games is that the Marine Corps set up infrastructure, like physical infrastructure and people to support TAC War at various commands and different echelons, right? So they did not only distribute and disseminate copies of these games and their rule sets, but they set up at Pendleton, Okinawa, and Lejeune, and various other bases, places where people could go. If you're a company commander, like I want to use TAC War, you can go to, I believe it was called a sim center, where you can get copies, learn how to play, get replacement for pieces, get new maps, and so forth. From the essentially late 70s to the early 90s, TAC War went through a series of expansions and adaptations as rules were adapted, the threat environment changed, but also they incorporated different terrain. Like there was a desert module, there was a wooded module, and so forth. But eventually, the TAC War family of games became really cumbersome to run, and eventually they became fell out of favor as the first Gulf War kicked off, right? And as the infrastructure that helped support it in terms of money, people, and space, right, eventually went away with budget cuts. So why is wargaming is important, right? Is that I've referred to Dedrick Dorner's logic of failure, which is geniuses are genius by birth, whereas the wise gain their wisdom through experience. And it seems to me that the ability to deal with these problems is the most appropriate way, is a hallmark of wisdom than genius. So if wisdom, it has to be earned through experience, right? Games are great experiential tools to add pages to our players and to our students, to our leaders, about how to see different problems in different ways. It is not about providing them a singular answer, but a way to provide them different experiences to serve as different reference points for their own decisions. There is the adage of saying that the military is always fighting the last war. This is not because the military is dumb, nor are they not well read. It is because we are experiential creatures, and if I, like for example, I fought during the surge in the Iraq War, right, during COIN, right? So my most powerful, emotionally charged, and formative memory of conflict is COIN, is Iraq patrolling the streets, right? It does not look anything like the Ukraine conflict, right? But when I think of war, that is the first image that pops up, right? Only through other experiences, right, through other deployments or through games or other experiential modes, can I add different conceptions and paradigms of what conflict will look like, right? And that is one way war games can help. And they're not the only medium, but that is one of the ways we can help, right? Because agency allows our players to remember better, and that is just, I mean, how engaged learning can help. So if that is how educational gaming is important and so forth, how about analytical games? There are two slides on this, and I will focus on this one very briefly, which is the cycle of research, which is Peter Perla's conception of how war games fit in a wider ecosystem of analysis, which is war games really focus on decisions of players, And then exercises really focus on what I call skills and actions. And then other forms of analysis often produce data or focus on data. And it is not that war games or exercises or other forms of analysis like M&S are better. It is merely that to look at the whole pie, right? Each of those methods only provide a slice, right? You have to focus your analytical method, and only by combining all these different methods can you get a better picture of what you're looking at. This graphic is best described by doing analysis, which is a Naval War College paper by Polsky and Logel, right? That looks at that sort of represent that. So if the war fighting problem is the middle, all these different things from exercises, experiments, war games, M&S, all add and look at different things, and you're trying your best to try to get to the middle of that Venn diagram where all these different modes of analysis and assessment are able to sort of feed into each other and reinforce each other's weaknesses, right? War games have weaknesses in low N values, right? Exercises are often colored by their training prerogatives, right? So, and organizational prerogatives, right? Different forms of analysis have other assumptions baked in as well. So they all have different benefits, right? But the idea is that if you get them together in the right set of these things together and you add them all as part of a wider cycle of analysis and research, then you're able to fill in some of those gaps better, right? And leverage their corresponding strengths and weaknesses. All right. So how do you analyze games? There's three major ways to think about analyzing games. They are not the only ways, but there are three major ways, which is to focus on the output of the game, which is like, who won, who lost. Are there certain metrics that ended it a certain way? For example, if you look at a climate change, you may say, hey, we want the outputs to be the levels of different greenhouse gases or something, or the level of sea rise in the game and so forth. It's less about winning, right? But that is one way to treat data coming out of games, right? Another is to actually focus on the decisions and less on the output. And that may be focused on saying, hey, I care less about if you win or lose the war. I care more about how you have used XYZ technology or XYZ concept and how you integrate risk and so forth, and the motives and logic that undercut those, right? So that is another way to slice war games. Another way is to sort of seek trends or insights across war games or across other methods, combining either inputs or outputs and decisions as well, right? One thing I will say about it is that any game is inherently limited by its objectives, right? There always will be an asterisk by every war game because not every game can represent all things all the time, all perfectly well, right? All games make abstractions, right? Bad games make abstractions and compromises that you cannot tolerate or that are actually incorrect. Good games make abstractions and compromises that are tolerable and understandable. Great games make abstractions and compromises that are almost negligible and or out of sight of from the player, right? Or the analysis. It has such a tight focus and that it makes the right compromises that the thing you're focused on has all the right level of detail, right? So if all games have caveats, right, as all methods do, right? How do we think about games, right? And is that we should often think of gameplay and the game results as a single observation of a series of decisions, right? They're contextual, right? A decision you did in a single war game is not the same decision you will have in a next game. Hobby gamers will understand this intuitively because if you have played the same rule set, the same games with different people, you will have different outcomes, different dynamics emerge, right? So games are not facts. They do not produce some kind of predictive like fortune telling ability of to see like if we win the war in Taiwan or anything else. There are single end, they're often low end value observations, right? Why this is important is these games are messy, as Ed McGrady often says. They're messy data, but they're important because the real world is messy, and we allow our ability to sort of see the forest for the trees, right? And see how all these decisions engage with each other in a dynamic human way, right? So, um, moving on to the next one is to think about how I think about design, right? So every designer will have their own approach. And this is sort of my rip away slide of how I think about games, right? And how I think about games as a designer. First things first is every designer will have their own method. You know what I mean? I am part of the CNA gaming team. There's about a dozen of us. We all have different levels of design. We all have different backgrounds. Like I love telling people this where see Winston's very excited as well, is that we have PhDs in mechanical engineering, we have PhDs in astrophysics, applied mathematics, we have masters in humanities and security studies, we have regional studies, we have all sorts of different backgrounds, and that allows us to think about games very differently, and it often provides a complementary approach to how we think about games, right? So for instance, my approach to game design is informed by my experiences as a hobby gamer, the games that I enjoy in my free time, the games that I've been exposed, which determines my gaming literacy, my experiences as a Marine, my experiences as a student, and so forth, right? And I bring all those skills and those experiences into my game and how I think about games. So if games are stories, right, how do I first approach a game is often thinking of a log line, right? So if you ever use Netflix or Hulu or even Amazon Prime to stream videos, you have seen a log line, right? A log line is different from like a tagline for a movie, which is often like sort of sensational. But log lines are really like a concise way to sort of be like, what is your movie about? Right? What is your like 3-second pitch? Right? And that is what your log line is, right? It is used for books, it is used for films most often, or series or TV series, but essentially follows a rough format, which is what is the inciting incident? What is the catalyst, right? That happens, right? Who are your protagonists or actors, right? What are they trying to do overall? And then what is the thing that they're moving against, whether that's a person, a storm, or some kind of phenomenon, right? Right. So, you know what I mean? Using Lord of the Rings as an example, right? The forces of evil are gathering. Saruman is waking up, right? That is the inciting incident, is the thing that starts propelling the story, right? Our protagonists Sam and Frodo decide to essentially go on a journey and form the Fellowship of the Ring to destroy the One Ring, right, against the forces of evil, right, and so forth. That is, it doesn't tell you how the game the story ends. It doesn't tell you all the bits, but it tells you like, hey, this is the thing that is the engine, the narrative storyline that holds all 3 books or 3 movies together, right? It is all often comes back to that single thing, right? Um, so why is this important? Is that it is often important to me is to get the image of what's the story I'm trying to tell. Because if my players are the characters, then I want to know what story they're engaging with, right? In this way, I'll borrow from Rolf Kostler, who is a famous and active both video game and manual tabletop game designer. If you have never read his book, The Theory of Fun, I highly recommend it. It is one of my favorite books about how to think about game design, right? And he often thinks about his games in nouns, verbs, and objects, right? Nouns are the units of action, right? The things that are doing something in a game. Verbs are the actions that are often linked to nouns, right? And then objects are resources or commodities in which your system bounds or enables nouns or verbs, right? A perfect example of this is using my own Littoral Commander game is that my nouns are tactical units, sections, platoons, companies, and single ships, right? So you have DDG 90, it is a noun, it is a unit of action, right? Its verbs in the game, right, is move, which is that 7 gray score, right? It can move, right? That is a major action. It is bounded by a constraint, which is an object, which is its mobility score, right? And also has 2 verbs, which is to conduct offensive fires and to conduct integrated air missile defense, the red and purple values, right? Those are its 3 actions, right? Or verbs, right? Associated with that single noun of a ship, right? Those have objects, right? I mentioned the score being limited by its mobility score, 7, right? And then 14 to the infinity represents long range strike. The game is sort of small, so that's why they have infinite strike range for the bounds of my tactical game. But they each have supplies. So they have 10 dice, a red dice, and 10 purple dice they can use, right? Those are their commodities. So when they do a combat action, I will ask them, hey, how much is DDG 90 committing to this fight? And they'll say, I'm committing 5 dice out of my 5 or 10 long range strike dice. They will move their tracker from 10 to 5. They'll roll 5 dice, and then combat is adjudicated. But essentially, that's how you can think about it: is who are the main units of actions? What are the verbs associated with each of those nouns? And what are different objects or resources that constrain either the nouns or the verbs themselves, right? The next thing I will say is that game mechanics are always simplifications, abstractions, and some kind of, you know what I mean, representation of a real world process or thing, right? And the level of abstraction, right, that often designers always talk about is how much you blur the edges, right? How many things are you clumping together for simplicity, right? For example, in Literal Commander, we don't consider radar in many regards, right? We assume that, you know, fire radar is part of the calculation and abstraction of interception, right? It is part of that PK, right? Similarly, we bind together, right, for interception scores, both like close quarters, like CWIS, right, and along with, let's say, SM2 and SM6 and so forth. Like we bind them all together to create a singular intercept score, right, across their depth of interception against air and cruise missile threats, right? So, you know what I mean? A dice roll can represent many different things, or you can break them out. Like in Harpoon 5, which is, you know what I mean, Larry Bond's game about modern warfare as well, right? Which is very detailed, right? He breaks out many of those elements, right? But they also increases the tension of accessibility and playability, which is my next point, is as you increase the level of detail, as you increase the number of steps in which your players have to hold knowledge, as you increase the number of verbs, the number of commodities, and the number of actions they can take, right? That increases or decreases the playability and accessibility of your game, right? It's not to say accessible games are better or really finite sort of reflective high fidelity games are bad. It's just that what do you need for your game, right? I was talking to some folks from DevCon for the Army, and they're looking at how weapon systems engage with each other in terms of like armor and stuff. And there, for their purposes, they need incredibly detail oriented, like break out every mechanic for armor and deflection and all that stuff, very similar to Harpoon, right? For naval combat, but for land combat, because that is like they're looking at the individual like engagement level, right, of a single vehicle engaging with another vehicle. Orientation matters, you know what I mean, how the round hits your vehicle matters, right? But that's for their purposes because they're looking at weapon systems, right, where all those details matter, right? But if you're looking at, let's say, an operational level game where you're trying to represent the GIF or the JTF sort of decision space, all that stuff is like the tactical level where your tactical commanders are thinking of, and you exist many realms above that, right? So where your attention is will depend on your constraints as a designer of like, if they're saying, hey, we have a senior leadership game that has to happen in 90 minutes, then your granularity will be different, right? But then for all games, playtesting is essential and constant, and it is your game will get better as you do it more, as you're more efficient with it. For Literal Commander, I designed the first prototype to get to the table, which had about like 20 cards for each player, most of the Orbat, about 90% there, and a couple maps, right? Within 6 months, right? In 6 months, on my own time, on weekends and stuff, right? COVID, quarantine help, right? My focus, where I just got this onto the table, right? But then I play tested it for a year and a half, right? With, you know, I ran it over 400 times virtually in person with different groups who were Marine Corps officers, enlisted leaders, Air Force officers, some mariners, all that stuff, right? Some mariners were always upset about the game, that the game wasn't about them. You know, same thing with SWOs, and so forth, right? So playtesting help feedback loops of like, is this number right? Is this how this should feel, right? Are the decision sequences in the space reflective of what you would think at this tactical level, and so forth, right? So what is Littoral Commander? If you have never heard about it, it is a commercially available game by the Dietz Foundation that I designed and published. The first module focuses on the Indo-Pacific. It was formerly known as Fleet Marine Force, and then its name was changed as it was going to publication. It typically plays 2 to 6 players. It is a high tactical or grand tactical war game, which means that like you're in charge of like companies and battalions, right? And your unit counters, your units of action, are often individual ships or like platoons, right? That's your typical range, right? The game really focuses on how the Marine Corps and Forces on 2030 and EABO and Stand-in Force will potentially look like. The game does not provide an opinion of if those concepts are good or bad. It just says, hey, if we do what we're going to do, how do we think about these problems in different ways, right? It is, although it is has a Marine Corps emphasis in the sense the major elements are Marine Corps elements, right? Based on the Marine Littoral Regiment or the MLR. It is also a joint game, right? In the sense that all the cards that the players have to play, which is one of the core mechanics of the game, represent different elements of the joint force. And often one of the first lessons that players learn is that the Marine Corps has to find ways to coordinate and contribute to the joint force. So if you're like, hey, what does Littoral Commander do for its players? It does four things, which is it forces them to actively plan and coordinate in teams against a thinking adversary, right? So you see a picture of College of Enlisted Military Education and Quantico of a bunch of sergeants playing at part of career school their capstone game of using Littoral Commander, right? They have to work as teams, they have to coordinate, each of them have their own task force, but they have to work together to achieve their mission or objective, right? They must operate in multi-domain or all domain and contested environments, right? There is no way that air can be contested, the underwater domain can be contested, cyber will be contested, in which they will try to degrade your network, they will try to do different EMS or electronic warfare effects on you, and you have to consider where you're taking risk. The game has logistical constraints mainly focused on munitions, mainly given the tactical focus of the game where it's about 2 or 3 hours per turn, and each game scenario is only about like less than a day, less than half a day, right? So often the munition that the supply constraint that is often most poignant is munitions, right? The second portion is that you have to think about where do you fit within the wider joint force, right? The game is designed to be educational, designed for military education, but is designed to be flexible. It is a scenario-driven game system where you can create different scenarios for the 4 different maps in the game. So there is Taiwan, the Luzon Straits, right? So the one you see in the picture, the upper Ryukyus, right? So Okinawa and the surrounding islands, and then Taiwan and sort of the Chinese coast, right? So those are the 4 maps in the base game, and you can create different scenarios for those, right? So like you can play Luzon and play 3 different kinds of scenarios: a sea denial, a sea control, land on ground fight, or maybe like you're trying to do a maritime raid. It can, the system is designed to be adaptable, right? Um, so what is the foundational schema of Littoral Commander, and how do I think about games? So the first thing I think about games is how do I build a mental model, what I call a schema. Some people call them models, right? I find in our field, it tends to confuse people with like thinking of models in Sims. So I call it a schema, right? What is the process? What is the mind map that I think about when I think about my game? So for Littoral Commander, the foundational schema is the F2 T2 EA process, or broadly known as the kill chain, right? For those who are unfamiliar with what that process represents, it is essentially saying, how do I find the enemy? How do I engage the enemy? And how do I assess what has happened, right? So the graphic on the right-hand side shows you that process of like find, fix, track, target, engage, assess, right? And this is not only just for kinetic fires, although that is often where it is most focused on. It can also represent how you can do this in cyberspace and so forth. But it is broadly the kill chain process. It is the foundational mental model that undercuts Littoral Commander, right? Ground combat is sort of abstracted to a great degree, while sort of this dynamic is the main focus of the game, right? This was because the Marine Littoral Regiment sort of focused on long-range fires and how ground forces can contribute to a maritime fight, right? And so forth, right? Also, is one of the focuses because I wanted to break out a generation of Marine Corps officers and joint officers and enlisted leaders whose minds, like mine, were stuck in coin, right? How do I think about where the threat is not 300 yards away, but it could be 30 kilometers away or 300 kilometers away, or at worst 1,300 kilometers away, right? I wanted them to think about that. So in terms to represent this, right, there are some mechanical elements that after I built that schema, I essentially layer on game mechanics to represent different things, right? So for example, in the game, you may only engage reveal targets. So you can only engage when you have tracked and targeted in the F2 T2 process, right? So find and fix, the game has counters on the map. So you already sort of have like, I mean, a general knowledge of where units are, right? And so now the question is, how do I get that from I know where you exist in a 20-kilometer across hex to I know where you are to deliver a warhead on your forehead level of detail, right? So that is the first challenge our planners or players have to make is how do I reveal targets through various modes of ISR, right? uh, Units that are firing in the offense or defense reveal themselves, right? As part of this cycle, right? Where you have to think about, am I willing to reveal or come out of MCON to engage this target and so forth, either in self-defense and or offensive fires, right? They can, but the status of knowledge of where a unit is temporal. They can conceal themselves. So I may fire upon somebody, they may defend themselves, and then on their impulse, they can also move and hide, right? So they have essentially changed their place on the board, and I have to go find them again. I have to now go back into the cycle of finding, fixing, tracking, and targeting, right? Different aircraft, right? Also, they're represented by cards, right? Like combat air patrol represent like a sort of F-35s or F-22s. There's different UASs. There are submarines that are cartoonishly abstracted, but they all have like detection requirements, right? So different capabilities that are stealthy, different things that are smaller, harder to detect, some things that are easier to detect, allow varying levels of detection requirements before you can even engage them, right? So for example, I ran Littoral Commander this morning. Someone was trying to engage, aircraft, failed the detection roll. So even though they had like combat air patrol, they just could not engage them because they did not find them, right, to engage them, right? So this mechanic is throughout the game. The game also has decoys or dummy counters so that not every counter on the board will actually be a real target. So for example, even earlier today, one of the players used ISR, revealed 2 units in a hex, and one of them were decoys, right? They thought they were going after a target and only really ended up being half the target they wanted. All right, so I'm gonna go through like a couple things about how different elements of the game that I wanted to highlight, which is one is how we use salvo equations from Wayne Hughes's seminal book Fleet Tactics to represent sort of the long range strike combat engine of the game. For those who have never read Fleet Tactics, I highly recommend it. If you want a shorter, a little bit more accessible version, there is a great recent book whose author's names escape me, but it's called Fighting the Fleet. There's actually an appendix by Wayne Hughes in it, and pulls from his work a lot, and I find it to be a pretty easy read. I finished it in a plane ride, right? So that is also available through the Naval Institute. So if you're unfamiliar with salvo equations and how Wayne Hughes thinks about salvo equations, I have a graphic on the left-hand side, but essentially is how much damage a ship or force A takes is interaction of 3 major elements, which is the offensive power of B, the attacker, deducted by the defensive power of A, the target, right? Applied, and whatever is left over, applied to its endurance power. It's a very simple mental model of how you do it. And obviously there's, abstractions in it and so forth, and world is not as neat, but as a mental model, this is how we should think about it. So in terms of missile age combat, right? So in the same way, littoral combat, the littoral combat system uses the exact same logic and mental model, right? Which is you roll X number of offensive dice and you subtract the number of successes, right? Rolled according to your probability to kill. So 14 and below, you need to roll 14s. I roll 5 dice. I get 1, 3, 7, 8, and 17. That means I get 4 hits, right? Then that is subtracted by the number of intercept dice. So if I roll, let's say, 14 and below for my intercept, I roll 5 again. For my defense, I roll 3 under 14. I subtract the 4 offensive dice with my 3 successful ones, and then I produce 1 hit, right? And that hit is applied to my ship's head points or its endurance power, which is 2, right? So if I get more than 2 hits, I die, I sink, or get destroyed, or I'm not mission capable. And then that is essentially how the game represents salvo equations in the game, right? For ground combat, we often use Trevor Dupuy's work, which is also who's a very famous ORSA researcher, and we looked at how to aggregate ground scores based on weapon types and look at expected number of casualties. We use the Excel function to figure out the different weapons. We gave them different weights and so forth. Both of these things in terms of PK and Dupuy's work, we use unclassed data where we can find it. For some of our weapon systems, our future projecting, we made some assumptions, or we use baseline relative scores off of things that we had more data about. For instance, hypersonics, we're like, well, hypersonics supposedly are much better than ballistic, and ballistics are better than some cruise missiles. So we sort of rack and stack them that way along our spectrum here. One thing I will say is that I always tell people, if you do not like the numbers that the game proposes, right? If you're like, hey, this thing has a PK of 70%, you know what I mean, 14 and below, I don't like that, right? I think, or I have super knowledge about why it's a real number is, I mean, 4, right? 40%. Then, you know what I mean, put a classify sticker on it and then like take a Sharpie to it and change it, right? Or if you just don't disagree, if you're a hobby gamer, you just disagree with my numbers, you have bought it, you can do whatever the hell you want with it, right? The point about the game is less about saying this system is better than this, is really thinking about if these systems all work together in this very complex tactical stew that you're stirring, right, with a bunch of decisions, what insights can we glean about our own decision making, about the adversary capabilities, and so forth, right? Next thing I want to talk about is terrain analysis. If you did not notice in previous photographs of Littoral Commander, the game is color coded. For those who are colorblind, there's also like a little number in each hex that determines like the color. Essentially, it gets a numeric score for how difficult it is. So 1 is the easiest, and all the way down up to 5, which is impassable, or you can't enter those areas. But essentially, where we did this was through the talented work of our geographer Matt Kramer, where he looked at essentially 4 different data sets along with others, but 4 primary ones, which is elevation models data over and then land cover raster data for like, you know, forested areas and so forth, right? And then infrastructure data like roads, rail quality, and so forth. And then biometry, which is like water depth, right? We took all 4 of those, we weighted them differently, and we use different vehicles as the baseline, right? So we use 4-wheeled like JLTVs, Humvees as the mobility mean, right? For ground vehicles, and we use like a DDG early Burke as the mean average for mobility for water depth, right? For naval movement, right? We took all of those, we bin them together, and essentially apply different modifiers to apply a systemic way to grade different hexes. So we told ArcGIS to look inside this 20-kilometer hex and essentially give me a score for each area, right? Looking across all these data sets, these 4 primary ones, to produce our terrain factor index, right? 1 through 5, right? These scores are not perfect. They don't, you know, I mean, they are averages, they are abstractions like everything else, but they're a way for us to provide a systemic way, a repeatable way, a way for us to show our homework of how we classify terrain and how to incorporate terrain into our game without making it onerous, right? So this is our way to do that, right? To make terrain important, but also sort of like abstracted enough that our players didn't have to worry about, is this like forested or is this like shrubbery, right? Like with some other tactical games, we want to avoid that, right? Also, at the same time, we took these maps in different draft forms and gave it to other subject matter experts to look, who are either geographers or other ArcGIS experts or other people who lived in the area that we were looking at, right? And we're like, hey, you know what I mean, we're currently doing the maps for the Baltics, right? And we are giving maps to our academic colleagues in the Baltics and saying like, hey, you live in this area, like, does this map relatively reflect your reality? And sometimes they'll be like, no, like you're missing this thing, right? Like the border with Belarus has now been like, you know what I mean, fortified, right? So there's a bunch of like immobile quarters that your map doesn't represent, right? And then we have a discussion as a team of whether should we represent that, is that something we should do, and so forth, right? But it's an iterative process, just like we did iterative process with the Salvo equations and Dupuy's models for ground combat scores and PKs for different types of munitions, right? But it provided a systemic way for us to show and apply analytical techniques of how we design games, right? But one thing I will say is I was honestly shockingly surprised when I first proposed this idea. I was like, this may not work, guys, but we're gonna try it. And when you look at it, the the ArcGIS, our method essentially provided the same maneuver corridors as we would have normally thought about it, right? So like, you know what I mean? You're like, if you look at the Luzon map, right, there are these two maneuver corridors up the spot, up along the west coast, and the sort of right along the middle between two mountains, and then you have these two massive mountain ranges that essentially cut the Luzon, which was same for MacArthur and World War II, and is the same today, right? Those highways have just been improved, but they really lateral movement across the island, just like Taiwan, is really difficult, right? So that's one thing I was really surprised at how well it turned out, right? Uh, because I do not want to just talk about my game often, I also want to talk about OWS, which was designed by Tim Barrack, who was a retired colonel out of the Marine Corps, but most importantly, he was the former director of the Marine Corps War Gaming Division in the Marine Corps Warfighting Lab at McWill. He is currently now the educational wargaming director at Marine Corps University, and he developed OWS in uniform as a colonel at McWill's Wargaming Division and has continued its development where he is a civilian now at MCU. The game is, I call it Littoral Commander's bigger brother, where it is literally physically bigger. Where I use this map because you saw the Luzon map, where my game only shows you the upper half of Luzon, and you see a picture of his map of the wider Indo-Pacific, and this map is like ginormous. It is like I think 70 inches by 42 inches wide, right? It takes up like 2 tables to do. You actually have to tape it together because it is so massive. You see it along the Philippines, that white scene. And each hex is 200 nautical miles across, if I remember correctly. So I joke with Tim that one of his hexes is my entire map, right? And one of his units, right, like unit pieces, is my entire like Orbat, right? And this is not to say it's a bad game. Actually, I think OWS is a great system if you want to look at operational art, looking at multi-domain capabilities across a theater, looking at like sort of the JTF level and how do I have multiple JTFs work together along different areas of operation across the same theater. If you're looking at that, this is a great game for you. This is the game for you. I joked with Tim saying that he created a game for his former self in the Marines, and I created a game for a former self in the Marines. I created a game for former Sergeant Bay. He created a game for former Colonel Barrack, right? And to just look at the same problem from two different angles, right? And OWS has various modules, including the Indo-Pacific module called Assassin's Mace. Griffin's Mace is the High North one. Zapad is the Russian module, and there's a Ukraine one called, I think, the Ukraine Steppes. And I think they're working on a global module along with, I think, a Middle East module, right? So it looks at different forces. They also have other allies and partner games. If you're interested in getting OWS, do not ask me, ask Tim. Tim has the secret little link that he will send you if you want to get it. But one thing I will say is that he only distributes the game to trusted actors, which often are U.S. government or allies partners, right? So if you're like a Five Eye or if you're a NATO partner, you can get access to it. If you are a U.S. DoD entity, you can probably get access to it. It is not a cheap game; it is printed on demand, but it is well worth your time if this is the space that you're looking at, right? Both these games, OWS and Littoral Commander, are going digitalization through the Marine Corps University's cloud initiative for its wargaming efforts, where they're going to be put on the cloud in digital forms using one is, I think OWS is using a Unity model as its architect, and then Hex Wars, which is a British-based company, is creating the Littoral Commander version of the game that will all go on the cloud, which is the notion of like, hey, does not matter where you are, as long as you're a Marine and you can get access to the system and register, you can wargame with anyone from Pendleton to whatever with access to these games that the Marine Corps University provides licenses to, whether that's Littoral Commander, whether that's OWS or other commercial titles, right? Like Command PE, Flashpoint campaigns, and so forth, right? So that is it's an ongoing process. They expect that to happen in the next year or two, and roll out as part of their wider Marine Corps University Cloud Initiative, which they're currently already using, right? I have one last slide, which is a summary slide of saying, hey, there is no substitute for designing one's first game from inception to execution. You can read all the books, listen to all the lectures, and it does not matter how good that lecturer is. There is no replacement for just designing your own game and getting the experience, right? It is the same idea of saying, hey, if I read a bunch of books about music theory and how to play instruments, that is important and you should definitely do it, but there is no replacement for actually just picking up a guitar and strumming strings. And it's the same way for design, right? Likewise, there's no similar theory. So if people always ask me, how do I get people into gaming? Whether it's my organization, my university, my unit, and I would say there is no replacement similarly for the thrill of beating somebody at a game, right? My first advice is always get them to the gaming table, drag them kicking and screaming, bribe them with beer and pizza, whatever you need to do. And I promise you, after they get their first taste of victory, loss, the emotion of winning and losing, the emotion of making that critical decision that either tips the balance one way or another, they will be hooked. And that's how you get them, right? So the top 3 photos are games that my students at Georgetown produce, and like a proud dad, I will, force you to all love them as I walk through them. Which is on the left-hand side is Initial Success and Total Failure, designed by my students in this past spring, where they've designed it for the Marine Corps EOD school. This is part of their current curriculum, and they want to look at how to apply EOD, SOP, and TTPs, right, techniques and procedures to a game. And it's a really interesting game. It's a really clever game. They worked with a bunch of master sergeants at the EOD school throughout the semester to create that game. The middle game is called Major's Gambit. It was designed for James Sterrett and Mike Dunn at U.S. Command and General Staff College as part of their curriculum there at CJSC. And it looks at brigade combat and sort of on a fictional terrain. And it's really focused on sort of like the OODA loop element, right? And it was and it is a huge portion of their curriculum for a single course, where they have, I think, like 18 copies of this game, where you see one copy. This is literally this year, a bunch of Army officers playing this game and a Marine Corps officer playing this game. We also did Thor's Hammer, which is another game on logistics in Norway that we created for them a couple years ago. And then Influence in the Pacific was designed for Air University, looking at dime and competition across the Indo-Pacific. So each team plays China or the US, and they have to compete for different elements of dime in each country, represented by hexes. Each hex represents or has different scores or requirements to buy that alignment. So think of Twilight Struggle, but just one step down. So instead of flipping an entire country by getting alignment, you can say I am flipping the military alignment of Thailand to the U.S., while the Chinese still have economic alignment Thailand, right? So the idea is that you can have this sort of like extra level of dimensionality and have different objectives and goals and and so forth that are secret. But that is part of their early playtest right before their final for our game. So for those who will get these slides, I will not dwell on these, but I have posted some links for different wargaming institutions from CNA, Georgetown, but the Krulak Center, the Joint Warfare Center for NATO, and Norway, and so forth. These are all different links you can look at. I have also included different links to articles, websites, books to recommend, and so forth, if you're interested about wargaming. And then lastly, I have my contact information. If you're interested in Georgetown, email me at my Georgetown email or anything else I do. If you're interested in CNA work, email me at my CNA email. And then if you're just interested in following my work and so forth, just follow me on Twitter. I refuse to call it X. Now I will take questions.
Thanks, Sebastian. If nobody has any right away, I have a few from the chat. Gary, I've got your 2 questions. The first one about unclassified sources, and then the second one about inserting hard topics like EW, comms denial, and cyber into games. Did you want to ask those of Sebastian yourself and elaborate on them? Or do you want me to just read them off?
Yeah, you can read them for simplicity. I don't have any elaborations, I don't think.
Okay.
Why don't you
All
go
right.
for what I wrote?
All right, appreciate it, Gary. So Sebastian, Gary's asking, when you mentioned the idea of getting unclassed sources, I mean, I have some that I've used for games and so on, but I think we would be interested in hearing what you recommend for suitable unclassed sources for parameters and combat systems.
Yeah, it depends. So I found actually Tradocs resources really, really useful for the unclassed stuff, right? Tradoc Odin, ODIN, is a website. It is the digitalization of their old equipment books that they hand out. I still have some of the old PDFs where they're like this weapon system or this tank, blah blah, and they'll give the specs of those things. They digitalize that to unclassed system, all distribution A on website. You can just Google it, Tradoc Odin, and they have databases by country, by domain, by different types. It is a little dated now as new capabilities are coming on. And if anyone from Tradoc is there, like please update it and add new things. I would love it, right? Right. So use that. I used a lot of it. They also Tradoc has 2 great landing pages for China and Russia. They have great documents on their tactical concepts, their doctrine, the Russian way of war or the Chinese way of war, how their brigades are structured, how their battalions are structured. Another great resource that I used when I was designing this game was the Naval War College does a series of great papers on the China problem, right? Looking at amphibious shipping, the maritime reports, right? So there was I read one on the amphibious brigades and how they work and the different reforms and how the rocket artillery. Another one is the oh crap, the Air Force has someone remind me, the Institute for China Studies is, I forget what it's called. It's bookmarked on my computer. It's Study for China Studies. It mainly focuses on the PLAF or the PLA, PLARF and the PLA Air Force, right? And the Rocket Force. They do amazing studies on those things, right? In terms of order of battle, different capabilities and different assessments, right? And they, you know what I mean? Odin at times, or for some of the weapon systems, will actually give you a PK they think you should be using on class, right? I have also used Jane's, right? Or even at times, if I'm desperate, use the manufacturer data that, like, you know, I mean, the producer will have. And I take those with a grain of salt, but like, if I can't find other numbers, I can't find other numbers. I've used other reports from NPS and you know, D-Ticker is great for people who are ORSAs and they're like, I'm gonna look at how like weapons engagement for short range air defense is. And you know what I mean? Those are great. I've used other game systems in the past for that were professional use, like CTAG. I looked through some of their appendices of how they thought about weapons warfare, missile warfare, and so forth. I looked at Harpoon, which has a lot of detail, right? So I pull from lots of different sources, and we try to collaborate them as much as possible. So when possible, we try to get 3 or 2 sources per thing and try to calibrate them accordingly. Sometimes it was harder for a lot of future stuff, so we have to do a lot of relative baselining for that, but that's how we did a lot of stuff. But Odin and Tradocs resources for Russia and China, I forgot they're called, the landing pages are great resources. Highly recommend. 10 out of 10.
Yeah, Charles, let me add to that. The danger I have experienced is most of us have really extensively high classified backgrounds from the military or contractor or government civilians. So when you go looking for unclassified sources and you see a parameter for this or a system description for that, and we know better from our classified experience, you know, the danger is having to dumb it down and accept an unclassified source to make the game go forward. Just an observation to add to that.
Yeah, so that's absolutely correct. So actually, so although I designed the vast majority of this game had the support for various elements of it by different people, like Matt Kramer, who was our geographer, who was, I mean, when he started on this game, he was an undergrad. I think he was a junior, right, an undergrad out of Oregon. Right? So I used some of my Georgetown students who didn't have classified backgrounds, and I would be like, hey, go find me the PK of this. Right. So to just be like, to limit my own bias. And they're like, the PK is 7. I'm like, okay, why do you think that is? Blah, blah, blah. And these are the sources. I'm like, okay, that's the PK then, right?
Yeah.
So that was one way I got around it. But yeah, I definitely have that of like, how do you sort what is classified and unclassified? But there are ways, I think, at least for myself, I found ways to get around it.
Yeah, you mentioned Jane's. That for us Navy gamers, Jane's Fighting Ships hasn't published for a number of years, as far as I can tell, quite a while. And I always found that to be a really useful source for descriptions, at least. Don't get any PKs out of there, but
Yep.
you get an awful lot of useful data. Am I missing something, or has Jane stopped publishing fighting ships and their fighting series?
So I'm not sure about their fighting series. I know they have taken a new business model where you have to do like different levels of subscription for different levels of databases, right? So that is how they've sort of gone as well. But yeah, I also miss those books as well. We have some
Yeah.
old copies at the office.
Okay, Charles, I'm done. You want to move over to EW?
Yeah, absolutely. So this was Gary's second question. Future wars are most likely to be preceded and then characterized by EW, comms denial, and cyber war. Loss of
Yeah.
networks and overhead ISR are seriously limiting. These are difficult to model, but they need to be injected into otherwise just kinetic games. Question: how would you insert EW, comms denial, and cyber war into games?
Oh, perfect. So I will tell you how I did it in Littoral Commander, right? Which is not the only way, but because we're giving examples of how I approach different things in Littoral Commander, I think is the most apt, which is the game has a mechanic called the Tactical Network card, where there's a tactical network card that represents all the various tactical networks that you rely on to do modern warfare, right? From Link 16, Blue Force Tracker, AFATIDS, and so forth, right? Name your system. It just sort of just aggregates that all into the single card, right? And if you see in the share slide, you see like 3-1 Charlie has two different munitions. It has a PK of 10 on the first one and a PK of 12 on the second one, right? But the important part about it is that if you do cyber attacks or EW attacks, right? You add degradation counters on or cubes on your opposing network, right? So if I attack Chuck, right, and his network, and I have 3 successful attacks, not only do I do whatever the card effect is, as a secondary effect, I am contesting your network. I'm making it harder for you just by acting upon it, right? And 2 or 3 cubes will reduce that PK number, your combat value number, by 4, right? 1 will do nothing. It gives you a little buffer zone because I joke that like we're all used to our computers not working to a certain degree. But 2 to 3 will reduce it by 4 across the board for both interception and long range strike values. And if you have 4 or more, it will reduce it by 7, right? You can remove cubes and essentially remediate your network, or even try have cards that will defend against trying to put cubes on it. But it forces our players, who are often very kinetic focused, to also think about how your network and how EW will affect it. We also have cards that will affect the C2 element of it. So our game uses an action activation system where you only have a limited number of actions you can do or orders you can give. And there are cards that will say, hey, like I'm doing some kind of jamming on your C2 system. It may not affect your units in terms of like freezing them or anything, but I'm reduce your actions from 3 to 2, right? Like EMS jamming or some kind of like that, to represent that I am essentially breaking your ability to issue orders effectively, right? Or command and control, right? So there are different ways we slice the baby in Littoral Commander, but we have mainly thought about in the commodities of actions, which represent C2, and then their effects on LRS or combat values or intercept values as the way to sort of incorporate cyber. Each card will have their own effects as well. Like, so a cyber attack will say like, roll 1 dice. If you get X number, freeze all the units in a single hex. They cannot conduct actions, right? So that's, but you will also add a cube to your opposing network. So like, you do that action, you also add cubes, so you can sort of stack effects, right? And some cyber effects will link with each other. Like, for example, we have a card that says like unmanned hacking, right? Which says like, hey, if the other opponent is using some kind of unmanned system, right? Roll a dice and you can essentially remove it, that you essentially cut the link between the controller and the device, right? And you essentially discard the card, right? And so forth like that. So there's a lot of cool interactions that the card driven mechanic allows in the game at the tactical level. All right, next question.
Yeah, thanks. I've got the game. I'll have to look deeper into that. That's the first time I've heard an extensive discussion of those kinds of constraints. Thanks.
Hey,
Nice.
man.
Okay, who else has a question? Either type it in the chat or go ahead and shoot.
Hey, Chuck, this is Fareed. I did put a question on the chat, and Sebastian,
Okay.
great presentation. Thank you for that. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on use of large language models in either getting help to design a game or getting assistance during execution of the game.
So, which is so fascinating that you asked me this because I always get asked this question recently. I wonder why. But
It's a hot topic, that's why.
it is a hot topic, right? So, in terms of like, let's say like the CNA team, and myself personally, we have all been exploring different technologies, right? Not limited to just AI, like ChatGPT, Bard, all those other ones, Sage, which is like a DoD CUI certified one, right? And there is generative AI image making, right? Like Midjourney and others, right? DALI. There is AR, augmented reality, VR. There's tabletop simulator. There's Vassal. There's old tech and stuff, right? So flippantly, I will say like, oh, I'll worry about AI when like my Microsoft can do like your like bullets like in Zipper, right? Like we don't even have JavaScript, right? On Zipper. So when people are like, "Oh, we're gonna get AI in Zipper," I'm like, "Man, I just want to open a PDF that doesn't take me 20 minutes to do," right? So that's sort of like my sort of half joking answer. But in terms of how we use these different AI tools, we've been experimenting with it. Honestly, we don't quite know yet. And we're trying different things. So we tried to use it as like story prompting, right? We will feed it a bunch of things and be like, hey, can it act like a sort of like a D&D master? We have seen some great hobby experimentation where D&D players have been using ChatGPT to create storylines or dialogue for like non-player characters in their stories, right? So they don't have to think about it all the time. So it eases a little bit of the burden. One thing I will say is that be careful for those who are trying to use like ChatGPT and other things, and think of it as a search engine. It is not. It is a language model. It is designed to be like a very fancy Cicero, right? Where it can speak really smoothly to you, but it has the intelligence of like a like a very like weird intern, right? So it will hallucinate things and make up sources. Like I will ask it questions about wargaming or just like daily news, and like one time it cited an article that I did not write. Like it said Sebastian Bay wrote this thing on War on the Rocks. I'm like, no, I didn't. Right? All right. So be careful what you're asking of it, and understand the constraints of it. But one of the things that we've been really interesting, actually a colleague of mine at CNA, one of my former students, Andrew Olson, has been doing is to feed ChatGPT prompts and link it up with an AI generative model, right? To essentially improve the image quality of some of these generative AI systems. So to pair some of these together to produce better graphics for us. And that's something that we've seen some really interesting things out of. But we can see it in the future, looking at like if you're able to train it, let's say on doctrine, like if you're like, hey, instead of like looking at the whole world of things, I just need you to be part search engine, part language model of like being able to engage with me, how to be like a fancy Alexa where I ask you questions about doctrine or capabilities and you answer back to me and I know you're not hallucinating, right? But it also raises really interesting questions about AI and trust with players and what they think they're willing to trust from data from players or from AI model. So it's a really interesting area. We're experimenting a lot with it. Within the bounds of what we can do. But in terms of government run games, I think it will be hard, mainly because our IT policies, which we're all governed by if you work on classified things, or a contractor or a govy, like our IT rules are like from the Stone Age. I think we still use like Vista and XP. So I mean, I'm not holding my breath to get like ChatGPT anytime soon.
Roger that. I agree with all your sentiments, from give me just mundane stuff that works and keep your AI for yourself to AI response back. It doesn't always say the reality, but it has tremendous potential and you can use it on your own specific private data without connecting to anything on the internet. So from a security point of view, you can control things and you can feed it doctrinal information or other kinds of things that it can react upon and bring it back. And I think things are going to go in that direction based on all the evidence that we see and the experiments that we've done. But I was just wondering what your reactions are, so I appreciate your feedback.
Oh yeah, I think that there's a high utility for it. Like for example, if you're able to, let's say, like for Matrix games, right? Could you have them be in a virtual Matrix game, have some players be um like ChatGPT or Bard, right? There was a great experiment using diplomacy and using ChatGPT to play. And diplomacy is all about dialogue and language and stuff like that. And if you have not read these articles about diplomacy and ChatGPT and other language models, it is fascinating. I highly recommend it. And the screenshots from the discussions from ChatGPT are so interesting. They will say like, "Oh, I'm sorry that I didn't respond. Like I was like texting my girlfriend," right? So it has like this level of like if you don't know it's a bot, it can trick you, right?
Yep.
And it's really interesting on how well it navigated that like negotiation space with language and discussion and so forth, and trust, right? There are things that you should be careful about how you take away from things, but for example, I can imagine a future where we can use ChatGPT to represent different countries and have a lot more like decision space, right? Instead of just relying on just experts, right? And so forth, that human experts that are in the room. You say, hey, I may not need a Micronesia as a as a real human player in my game, but in my competition game, maybe I have a Micronesia like ChatGPT model where I ask it things and it will spit out an answer that or give me some kind of feedback loop, right? For the players, while for some other countries that like Japan and so forth, I still have them be played by players in cells. So yeah, interesting space. I see David's question about what do you have? Do you have thoughts on scenario design? Yeah, David, I have lots of thoughts on scenario design. Do you want to be here for another 2 hours? So I would say for scenario design, I like I pull from my background, which is I used to do a lot of freelance journalism for Tom Riggs at Foreign Policy, and I used to write short stories. So I come from that perspective, and I like to think of them as storylines, as characters, and like what is the thing. And that's why I use log lines. It's a thing that works for my brain and how I think of scenario design. But for my students, I always tell them there are a couple techniques you can do. Forward projection, right, where you start off with a beginning point and move forward and be like, hey, like this has happened, so this may lead to this, and you sort of build a timeline into the future to the point that you need from a single stepping off point. You can go backwards and do a regression sort of approach where you say, hey, this game needs a invasion of, I don't know, the Philippines, right? So how do I get from invasion of the Philippines in whatever year, and what are the things that necessarily need to happen for me to get an invasion of the Philippines, right? Right, and then go backwards, right, and so forth. Another another method is I actually used when I was doing writing and brainstorming is like concentric models, where you start off with one core assumption or a set of assumptions of your world, and then you build your world outwards in rings of saying like, if this has happened, if we have robot panda overlords, right, what does that mean, right? And you're like, okay, if we have robot panda overlords, do they like bamboo, right? And does that mean bamboo prices are up? And does that mean countries that have bamboo have like more economic wealth, right? And you sort of build out that words, right? And that's like this sort of concentric model of like story building and world building as well. So there's lots of great writing on how to do scenario design and storytelling. I use a lot of references from literature of how to do creative storytelling and short story writing, because that's how I conceive of it. Are there any other questions?
Really quick, we have something good comment that's just popped up from Thomas Holland, but and just time check for everybody, we're at 90 minutes. Gary suggested that scenario design could be the topic for a follow-on session, and I think we're going to explore that. Maybe do a follow-on session. Sebastian, if you're willing to come back, maybe we'll assemble a panel, 2 or 3 different designers, and get them together and talk about scenario design. But Thomas, if you're on and you have a mic, I'll let you go over what you just posted if you'd like to.
Well, just to put something in there for the record with regards to the AI, since I do teach an AI class, I've been doing that stuff for a long time before it was cool, right? But yeah, the large language models are exactly that. I do teach that, but if you have like a list of bullets and concepts and stuff, and you want it to be written into a paragraph or something, It works very good for that. And some of my students have enjoyed being able to take stuff that, yeah, they've got the information, but gee, they just can't get over the writing part of it. And then when they do that and see that essentially having tuned their large language model to what they're doing, they feel much more at ease with it. And I think they get the idea that it is not really thinking. And Sebastian, you mentioned, the Chat GPT, especially 3.5 and that flavor, creating references that don't exist. In fact, I demonstrate that in one of my courses where it produces really good looking references. And it's like, hey, I know that person, but you ask it, is that reference legitimate? And it says, oh, I'm sorry, I'm just a large language model. But it actually told me on one of them, but had this person written this, it would have been something like this. It was really cool.
I think ChatGPT was telling me that I need to write more, which is probably true. And I'm like, okay, ChatGPT, enough of your judgment for the evening.
Exactly. It can be fun though, but yeah, it's your points were well taken, and Fareed, so was yours. Those were both correct in my experience.
So
a great
overall,
presentation, by the way.
Yeah, thank you. Overall, I would say ChatGPT, like anything, is a tool.
Exactly.
And you have to understand its limits and what it does really well, right? So I think the real question is like, hey, be literate enough to understand what it does well and what does wrong, right? Like for example, Command PE, right? It is a game that and a system that a lot more people are using in our professional circles. I get emails about it periodically of like, should we use Command PE as our wargaming platform? I'm like, well, my first question is like, is that what you need, right?
Why are you wargaming?
Why are you wargaming? What is the thing, right? If you're like OSD, you probably don't need Command, right? If you're like a DevCom or if you're like Transcom, maybe Command PE can be worked in certain ways. But I also say like, also understand the limitations of what you're thinking, right? So like, even though let's say Command PE is a very good platform in many regards and does certain things really well, right? There are fundamental things about that system that you do not know how it works, right? Like for example, you're like, how does this sonar model work, right? It never tells you, right? Yes, you can populate the data set differently, both with classified and unclassified data if you have the classified version of Command PE on Zipper, but it does not, like, you don't know what it does with that, point whatever data you gave your submarine, right? It does not explain a sonar model. It does not explain or able to really do things. And we have done things with it where it produces like inconsistent results for the same data set. And you're like, why is there a deviation? We have run the same scenario and you're telling me this thing is pinging at different times irregularly. And you can't explain to me why, right? So black box syndrome is a big thing. Same thing with other GOTS tools as well. Like I had the same experience with MTORs, right? I use MTORs for a command post exercise. And one of the Marines colonels came into me like yelling at me. He's like, hey, why did you kill like my entire company? I was like, what are you talking about? So I like go through MTORs and I realized their company hit IED that I placed in the system, right? And the system is like, hey, they hit an IED. There have been 100 and something casualties. I was like, what the hell, right? So I had to dig a little bit deeper, but essentially the order of battle, the TO&E for that company had 2 vehicles, right? So MTORs, when they submit the order for the company to move to B, point B, right? They essentially, what MTORs did was stack all the humans like on top of each other, like a clown car, right, on both vehicles, and then move the entire company on 2 vehicles along the rate of movement for the vehicle. So when the one vehicle hit the IED, it just killed everyone in that vehicle, which was like 100 and something people, right? And I was like, you know what I mean? So you have to understand how your model is working, how your thing is doing, how it is engaging with other elements, what the data it comes from, and at least understand its limits, right? It's not to say MTORs is a bad tool, it just has limits and you have to be careful how you use it, right? The tool is only as good or as bad as the user, right? And often it is out of ignorance of what the thing can or should be designed to do.
All right, folks. I apologize, but in the interest of time, I think we're going to be wrapping up here in a few minutes. Let me go ahead and put this up. There's some stay involved information. You'll get all this as well as Sebastian. Are you okay with sharing your slides?
Did I send them to you?
You may have. If not, I'll get them from you after the meeting.
Yeah. Sounds good.
So I will have a link to the recorded video, Sebastian's slides, plus information about joining our forum. We do 2 different meetings a month. We try to have a guest speaker or a guest panel once every month or 2 at least. We talk about all things wargaming. Specifically, our organization looks at the intersection between wargaming and simulation. But for us, simulation, mostly we mean digital computer simulation, but not necessarily. So that's a little bit about us. You're certainly welcome to join. We're a good adjunct if you're already a member of, say, Moores or Goose or one of the other organizations. Many of the other great organizations out there. But Sebastian, thank you so much. This was a great presentation, great conversation, and I definitely enjoyed hearing about what's going on.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you for having me. It was a good time, great questions and great discussion. And feel free to reach out if you have any other follow-up questions.
All right, great. Thanks, folks. Have a great day, and thank you for participating.
Thank you, Chuck, for hosting. Great job.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks, Thomas.